grand old rag, you're a high-flying flag, and forever in peace may you wave.
It was the dawn of the 20th century. The United States was continuing to undergo the emergence of mass production, led by the Industrial Revolution that started around 150 years before. At the same time, a new wave of progressivism was also starting to form, a movement which entertained discarding the current system for the treatment of industrial workers that had not been altered since the revolution began. As a result, a difficult battle formed between these two sides and made discussion of industries in general quite controversial. This would soon begin to change. It was on a cold, windy Saturday in March of 1911 when a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. In less than a half an hour, it became one of the deadliest industrial disasters in American history. Despite its large number of casualties, the intensity of the event propelled the power of the rising progressive movement, yielding a reformation that would not only save many more lives afterwards, but also form the foundation of what is recognized as the modern workplace. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company was founded in 1900 by Russian immigrants Max Blank and Isaac Harris. Both men had around 10 years of experience in the garment industry, so it did not take long for word to get around about their new business, giving them the nickname Shirtwaist Kings. The shirtwaist was a new trend in women's fashion, popularized by Charles Dana Gibson's creation of the Gibson Girl. The Gibson Girl represented the ideal independent woman. She was featured in many newspapers and magazines, and often wore a blouse-like upper garment known as a shirtwaist. Because of how her character was depicted to the public, shirtwaists became a popular outfit among employed women, particularly those working in industrial facilities. Blank and Harris's adept knowledge in the clothing industry and the popularization of these garments made the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory successful, enabling them to move their business from a small shop on Wooster Street to occupying nearly a third of the Osh Building on the west side of Manhattan. While business certainly prospered, working conditions did not. The majority of workers at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory were immigrant women from Italy and Eastern Europe, as young as age 14. This demographic allowed the company to give their workers severely underpaid wages and overly long working hours. Employees worked 7 days a week, 12 hours per day. Work environments were congested. Most doors were locked, and ventilation was almost non-existent.
And what did they pay?
And what they did, as I said at times, they were generous in giving you the little apple pie. You know? My own wages when I got to the Triangle Shirtwaist Company was $1.50 a week. And by the time I left during the shirtwaist making strike in 1909, I had worked myself up to $6.
Magnificent.
In short, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was essentially a sweatshop. Although, these aspects of industrial life did not go ignored. Maltreatment was a recognized issue among factory workers. Even since the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of manufacturing plants, factory workplace regulations remained relatively stagnant, and safety was not much of a concern. For many employees, a call for change was in order, which led to the advent of the progressive movement. In late 1909, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union went on strike in protest of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. Over 20,000 people attended. Aside from a slight increase in wages for the employees, nothing changed. Just 1 year later, on Saturday, March 25th, at around 4:30 in the afternoon, the 500 employees of the factory were tidying things up and preparing to go home. Those who were leaving to go enjoy the rest of the weekend that they had left were exiting through the Green Street stairs. Most of the other doors, including emergency exits, were kept locked to prevent people from taking overlong breaks, to keep out union organizers, and to monitor employees for factory theft. It is on the 8th floor where a small cloud of smoke began to emit from a bin filled with discarded scraps of fabric. Because of the large amounts of littered fabric and tissue remnants, the lack of a sprinkler system, and the puddles of oil that dripped from the sewing machines, flames quickly developed, and the fire began to spread at a rapid rate. The fire buckets were inadequate, and the building's emergency hose was completely corroded away, rendering unsuccessful attempts to extinguish the massive inferno which now engulfed the 8th floor. A bookkeeper was able to notify the 10th floor via telephone, giving them time to evacuate the building before the fire continued to grow. All but one person got out alive. Nobody notified the 9th floor. They did not find out about the fire until the flames had already caught up to them. Workers were panic-stricken. Many tried to escape the scene through the only fire escape in the building. The number of people exceeded the fire staircase's carrying capacity, causing it to collapse. Multiple people fell to their deaths. Only one elevator was working in the entire building. It got about 40 people out safely before giving out. Those who could not make it in time fatally jumped into the elevator shaft. Employees tried exiting through the Washington Place stairway, but this was one of the many doors that had been locked. Floor management was able to use the keys to this stairway to successfully let them out. Immediately after, the fire swallowed the entire Washington Place pathway. The only unlocked exit, the Green Street stairway, was completely surrounded by flames. Firemen arrived within the first 5 minutes of the incident, but they were not prepared to be confronted with something this catastrophic. New York's firefighting equipment was far too primitive to put out the fire in the factory building using standard procedure. The farthest distance the fire hoses could reach was the 7th floor. They were unable to put out the fire. The ladders could also not reach the top floors. Safety nets were too weak to withstand weight from such a high distance. There was no escape. Many factory workers accepted their fate by jumping from the windows, plummeting to the pavement. Those who did not jump instead burned to death. Due to the building's poor ventilation system, others died from smoke inhalation. Crowds surrounded the burning ash building. Screams roared from the incandescent windows, met with the sounds of loud thuds from dozens of living people who jumped from the high-rises, striking the sidewalk at high speeds. People down below shout to these workers not to jump, but these attempts would be ineffective, as those who did not jump would instead be affected directly by the fire. Firefighters wept as they tried everything they could to capture the countless bodies of people who chose to plunge to their deaths. Many workers held hands and hugged one another before diving off the windowsills. In just under 20 minutes, over 100 people were dead. It was now the single deadliest workplace disaster in New York City's history. The streets had a metallic smell, which resulted from the puddles of blood which formed from those who nosedived from the top 3 floors of the building. Blood mixed with hose water flooded the streets, running red streams that poured into the gutters. 7 of the bodies from the incident remained unidentified. Around 2 weeks later, a mass funeral was held for the factory fire victims. Over 500,000 people attended. Calamity ensued from an incident that could have easily been prevented. Many of the factory employees that were victim of the fire were the same people who participated in the shirtwaist strikes just 1 year before. Because their calls for activism were essentially ignored by the higher-ups of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, their greatest fears had come true. Blank and Harris were tried for second-degree manslaughter just months after the incident. Although, these charges were eventually dropped, as it was successfully argued that the owners had not broken any laws and that there was no way to prove that they were actually aware that the exit doors of the building were locked. Despite appearing before the court, the owners would continue with their behavior. People felt that this had to be stopped. One person who was in the crowd that watched the horrors that played out on that Saturday afternoon was Frances Perkins. Perkins was the leader of the New York Consumers League and was a major advocate for improving the working conditions and safety regulations in factory jobs. Her views for making changes, such as enhancing the overall quality of fire escapes and installing sprinklers on all floors of workplace buildings, were deemed radical at the time. Although, she felt that the Triangle Fire was the quintessential reason to conceive these changes. Perkins then took the unions of the Shirtwaist Factory, along with those who participated in the uprising of the 20,000 strikes, and formed the Committee on Safety. The group fought for new legislation, proposing bills such as the 54-hour bill, which decreased the total number of working hours in the week and raised the minimum age requirement for factory workers to be no younger than 14 years old. The committee also pushed for adequate fire equipment in all workplace facilities and compensation for those injured or killed in any workplace disaster. With enough convincing and with the support of the influential progressives, they were able to persuade Tammany Hall, who originally lobbied for the traditional values of business and anti-union sentiment, to now represent factory workers. This newly acquired powerful political influence allowed the committee to make the changes that they had been fighting for. Because of this, these bills were successfully ratified. Sprinkler systems were now required in all multi-story buildings, and all emergency exits were to remain unlocked at all times. In order for both of these things to be properly used, fire drills were now mandatory in the workplace.
Although most of you are familiar with the names and the faces of the present members of the Cabinet, I shall take the liberty of introducing them to you. Secretary of Agriculture, Mr. Wallace, and on the end of the line, Ms. Perkins, the Secretary of Labor.
Perkins' efforts were noticed by New York Senator Franklin D. Roosevelt, who, upon his election as President of the United States in 1933, appointed Perkins as the fourth Secretary of Labor and the very first woman to become a part of the United States Cabinet. Because of the persistence of the Committee of Safety, working conditions not only got better, but lives were being saved. The consequences of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire showed that these victims did not die in vain. The tragedy of the event would later be proven effective in calling for necessary changes and creating laws that would make the industrial workplace a much safer environment, many of which are still in effect today. Every year, labor unions band together and march in front of the building where the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory once existed. By commemorating those who lost their lives on that day over 100 years ago, they respect the wishes of Frances Perkins and those who fought with her to prevent this kind of disaster from ever happening again.
Goodbye! Come, Josephine.